What is your vision on childcare and on gender issues and the tension and relation between these two concepts?
I think it's really important what you just said, that there are positive relations. It can be done. Services can be provided in ways that meet children's rights and children's needs, but at the same time also the rights and needs of the parents and of mothers, of fathers, of families. And I think what we would like to emphasize is that there are also some tensions, and that there can be child-centered programs which make certain assumptions about how family works, what mothers do, which then can put children's needs and interests in tension with those of women in particular. I think there has been historically a concern about sort of service provisioning for children or other kinds of provisioning for children, which assume that those children have mothers who have nothing else to do but to look after the children. And of course that is a problematic assumption to make in the case of many families in Latin America, elsewhere in the world, where a lot of women who have children and who are very concerned about their children's needs and interests don't have a huge amount of time on their hands. They have to also, many of them work. Many of them have very demanding sort of work routines that doesn't provide the kind of time that child-centered programs sometimes assume that mothers have. For example, we can think of a lot of community initiatives which have existed, in many countries for many years, but which have also been kind of revitalized and reinforced in recent years under the name of community participation, which very often demand that children who have access to those services, that they be given access and they can use those services on the condition that, for example, mothers perform a certain number of hours of work in the school, maintaining school facilities, let's say, or providing other kinds of essentially unpaid services to those schools. I mean, the reason why many of these community programs do that is, of course, because they don't want to get access to those kinds of services on the market for which they would have to pay. So very often what happens is that very often very poor families who don't have any other choice but accessing those services, who end up giving a lot of their time for free on an unpaid basis, and that kind of makes a kind of assumption about the parents and the mothers in particular, which may not hold in reality, and which may really work to the disadvantage of those families and of the parents and the mothers in particular.
Okay, and which are the different roles that can the private sector and the public sector present so as to solve these kind of tensions, or try to?
I think, obviously, the public sector in particular, I would think that in terms of provisioning of care services, of early education services, having reliable and good quality public services is really a very important ingredient. And I think to sort of very lazily say that private and public can work together in harmony, that raises, for me, it raises a lot of questions. Of course, if you have a very strong public sector and the state has a very strong capacity, both financial capacity as well as administrative capacity, to really impose regulations on private actors, private sector provisioners, then you can ask, if the private sector is participating in providing certain services, then you can ask the private sector to go by certain rules, by certain regulations, for example, in terms of accepting children from different income households, and the state can subsidize the participation of those children in the services. But very often what happens is that the state doesn't really play that role. So under the label of private-public mix, what you get is you get public services that are often underfunded and often accessed by people with limited economic means, and then you get private services that therefore reach only those who can afford to pay for those services. So you get very kind of, if you like, stratified or segmented systems that function in parallel to each other. So I think we should be very careful about thinking what do we exactly mean when we talk about a private-public mix. I mean, I can think of countries, let's say, like Korea, where the private sector delivers a lot of the education. But there the state assumes a very important role in terms of controlling the quality of service that is provided. It sets certain standards in terms of for example, number of children per teacher, in terms of the kind of quality of service that is provided. Also in terms of guaranteeing the working conditions of the teachers and those who work in those services. And very importantly, where the state kind of subsidizes the participation and access of people and children from low-income households to the same services. So in effect, children from different households in the across economic spectrum could participate and have access to private services, but the participation and access of low-income households is effectively subsidized by the state, who pays the providers for those households. So I think that can be a very nice solution. And as I said, Korea is a very good example where you can find that kind of system working. But very often we talk about having a mix, a public sector and private sector mix, in countries where that kind of capacity doesn't exist. And that then, I think, leads to having very stratified systems that work in parallel, and where you tend to get very poor quality services for the poor. And I think that's a danger that we see in having this kind of public-private mix.
Right. And what do you think the role of a private sector on other industries can work with their own with their own employees and with their own human resources? Can they work from there?
Well, I don't think you can do it in a voluntaristic way, in the way that now we have this whole idea of corporate social responsibility, that the corporate sector voluntarily will do a lot of good things. I think you have to have very clear regulations, state regulations, and there should be accountability mechanisms. I mean, one thing that in some contexts and in this region, enterprises have historically done, for example, has been the provision of, for example, creches in the enterprise for the employees who have young children. And historically, this has very often been for female employees, and I think it would be a good thing if it wasn't just the female employees, if it was for all employees. So bringing children to the school and having access to those kind of services was not just linked via the mother, but via any of the whoever is the main carer, whether it's the mother or it's the father or someone else who's in charge of the child. So that certainly is something that enterprises have historically done, which they can continue doing. But given the realities of labor markets, in this region and in many other regions in the world, where you have the bulk of the employed population working in the informal economy, that is very difficult to rely on kind of enterprise-based services for provision of care services, because it will, even at its best, even if it works, even if the regulations are followed, it will only reach employees that constitute, let's say, in Argentina, something like 50%, if 50% of the workforce, even if the regulations are put in place, which of course they're not. And implementation of those regulations varies, across industries and across the public and private sector. So there is some scope, but I would say that even if it works in the best of conditions, it's limited. But very importantly, I don't think that the corporate sector or private enterprises can be relied upon to take those measures voluntarily. I think there has to be very, very clear state regulation and very clear accountability mechanisms, in the way that, historically that was the model in many parts of the world. But at the end of the day, it has never been done voluntarily by the private sector in a way that can guarantee rights to all employees.